On a Virginia plantation in 1856, a black man named Benjamin Clarke did something that would change the lives of 200 enslaved people without a single white person realizing what was happening until it was far too late. He organized the most sophisticated underground resistance network in the South, not through violence or dramatic escape, but through something far more powerful. A rebellion of the mind, spirit, and collective will that transformed slavery from within while appearing to his masters as nothing more than ordinary plantation life. Before we begin this extraordinary journey into one of history's most brilliantly executed acts of resistance, I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. We uncover forgotten stories of courage, intelligence, and the unbreakable human spirit every week. These are the histories that deserve to be remembered, the black heroes whose brilliance changed the world, the ancestors whose strategies for survival and resistance continue to inspire us today. Now let me take you back to 1856, to the Carter Plantation in Virginia, where Benjamin Clarke was about to begin a revolution that no one would see coming. The Carter Plantation sprawled across 2,000 acres of Virginia's rich soil, its fields worked by 147 enslaved black people whose labor generated wealth they would never touch. The main house stood like a white monument to stolen prosperity, 3 stories of colonial architecture overlooking tobacco fields that stretched to distant tree lines. Behind the grand house, arranged in precise rows, stood the quarters where black families lived in wooden cabins, where children were born into bondage, where elders died having never known freedom, where humanity persisted despite systematic efforts to crush it. Benjamin Clarke was 34 years old in 1856, born on this plantation to parents who'd been enslaved here before him. His mother, Rachel, had worked in the main house until her death when Benjamin was 12. His father, Isaac, had been a skilled blacksmith, a man whose dark hands could shape iron into anything, though he'd been sold south when Benjamin was 15 to pay gambling debts of the previous Carter generation. Benjamin remembered his father's face, the intelligence in his dark eyes, the stories he'd told about resistance and survival, about never letting white people see the fullness of what black people truly were. Benjamin possessed qualities that made him exceptional, though he'd spent his entire life carefully hiding those qualities from white observation. He had a brilliant strategic mind, the kind that could see patterns others missed, predict consequences several steps ahead, understand complex systems and how to manipulate them. He had natural leadership abilities that drew people to him, made them trust him, inspired them to believe in possibilities beyond their current circumstances. And he had something perhaps even more valuable: patience combined with determination. The understanding that meaningful change required careful planning and persistent effort, rather than dramatic gestures that would bring violent reprisals. But what truly set Benjamin apart was his understanding that the most effective rebellion wasn't the one white people could see and crush. It was the one that happened invisibly, that transformed minds and spirits and communities while appearing to leave everything unchanged. It was resistance that worked like water wearing away stone, subtle and persistent and ultimately unstoppable. The Carter Plantation was managed by James Carter, a white man in his 50s who'd inherited both land and the people who worked it from his father. Carter considered himself a progressive slave owner, believing his relatively moderate approach to physical punishment made him benevolent. He permitted Sunday rest, allowed limited garden plots, didn't separate families unless financial necessity required it. He never understood that any degree of owning human beings was evil, that moderate oppression was still oppression, that his self-image as an enlightened master was simply self-deception that made his participation in evil more palatable. The overseer was a brutal white man named Thomas Brennan, who believed black people required harsh control to remain productive. Brennan carried a whip and used it regularly, patrolled the fields looking for any sign of resistance, enforced rules designed to keep black people broken and afraid. He understood, instinctively, that educated black people threatened the system, that thinking black people were dangerous, that any sign of black independence needed to be crushed immediately. Benjamin had been watching, learning, planning for years. He'd observed how the plantation operated, identified its vulnerabilities, understood the psychology of the white people who claimed to own him. He'd built trust with other enslaved people, demonstrated leadership through small acts of support and protection, established himself as someone who could be relied upon. And he'd been waiting for the right moment, the right circumstances, to begin the work he'd been preparing for his entire adult life. That moment arrived in the spring of 1856, when Carter made a decision that would inadvertently provide Benjamin with the opportunity he'd been waiting for. The plantation had grown too large for efficient management. Carter decided to reorganize labor assignments, creating work crews with designated leaders who would report to Brennan. It was meant to improve productivity by creating clear chains of command. What Carter didn't realize was that he was about to give Benjamin official authority that could be used for purposes entirely contrary to Carter's interests. Benjamin was appointed leader of the largest work crew, 43 black men and women responsible for the main tobacco fields. The appointment made sense from Carter's perspective. Benjamin was skilled, reliable, appeared submissive to white authority, commanded respect from other enslaved workers. Carter thought he was simply selecting the most capable worker for a supervisory role. He didn't realize he was handing organizational power to a brilliant mind that had been planning resistance for years. The first thing Benjamin did with his new position was deliberately subtle. He began spending time with each member of his crew individually, getting to know them not just as workers, but as full human beings. He learned their stories, their strengths, their fears, their hopes for their children. He listened more than he spoke, building trust through genuine interest and careful attention. He identified those who possessed qualities that would be valuable for what he was planning: intelligence, courage, discretion, leadership potential, specific skills that could contribute to collective resistance. Among those Benjamin identified was Sarah, a 30-year-old black woman who possessed extraordinary ability to read people and situations. Sarah worked in the fields, but her real gift was psychological insight, understanding motivations and predicting behavior with uncanny accuracy. Benjamin recognized that Sarah could help him understand how white people would react to various situations, how to manipulate their perceptions, how to create the appearance of normalcy while building something revolutionary underneath. There was Moses, a 58-year-old black man who'd been enslaved on the Carter plantation for 4 decades. Moses possessed deep knowledge of the plantation's operations, its rhythms and patterns, its vulnerabilities and opportunities. More importantly, Moses was respected by everyone in the black community, an elder whose wisdom and experience commanded natural authority. Benjamin knew that Moses' support would be crucial for building the broader network he envisioned. There was Hannah, a 26-year-old black woman with remarkable organizational abilities. Hannah had been coordinating the communal garden plots that enslaved people were permitted to maintain, managing complex logistics of who grew what and how surplus was distributed. Benjamin saw that Hannah's skills could be applied to organizing something far more significant than vegetables. There was Jacob, a 19-year-old black man with fierce intelligence and impatience for freedom. Jacob represented the younger generation, those who'd grown up hearing stories about escapes and rebellions, who were less willing to accept their enslavement passively. Benjamin knew that Jacob's energy and courage would be essential, but also that Jacob's impatience needed to be channeled carefully to avoid premature action that could destroy everything. Benjamin began meeting with these individuals privately. Careful conversations during brief breaks in fieldwork, whispered exchanges while moving between tasks, coded discussions that sounded like ordinary conversation to anyone who might overhear. He started by asking questions rather than making statements, gauging how each person thought about their situation, testing their willingness to imagine alternatives to their current circumstances. "Do you ever wonder what would happen if we organized differently?" Benjamin asked Sarah one evening as they walked from the fields. "Not rebellion against the masters, but rebellion of how we think about ourselves, how we support each other, how we preserve what's human in us despite their efforts to destroy it." Sarah studied Benjamin with her penetrating dark eyes, understanding immediately that this was more than casual conversation. "I wonder about that all the time. I wonder what would happen if we black people stopped letting them define who we are, if we created our own definitions, our own ways of being, our own systems of support that they couldn't see or control." "What if we did more than wonder?" Benjamin said quietly. "What if we actually built that? Not in ways they'd recognize as resistance, but in ways that would transform our community from within, make us stronger, more unified, more prepared for whatever future comes." Sarah was silent for a moment, calculating risks and possibilities. "You're talking about something dangerous. If they discovered organized resistance of any kind, they'd destroy everyone involved." "Only if they could see it," Benjamin replied. "But what if the resistance looked like exactly what they expect? What if we appeared to be nothing more than obedient slaves, while actually building something they couldn't imagine? What if we organized a rebellion they'd never notice until it was far too late to stop?" This conversation pattern repeated with Moses, with Hannah, with Jacob, with each person Benjamin identified as crucial to his vision. He never pushed, never demanded commitment, simply presented ideas and waited for people to reach their own conclusions. He understood that forced compliance was useless for what he was planning. He needed willing participants who understood the goals and embraced them fully, who would maintain operational security even under pressure, who believed deeply enough in the vision to persist despite obstacles. Over weeks, Benjamin assembled his core group: Sarah, Moses, Hannah, Jacob, and 6 others who possessed the intelligence, courage, and discretion necessary for this work. 10 people who would form the foundation of something unprecedented. 10 black people who would begin organizing a rebellion that would happen invisibly, that would transform enslaved people's consciousness and community while leaving the plantation's surface operations appearing entirely normal. Their first meeting happened on a Sunday evening in June, after the day's rest, in the woods beyond the quarters. They gathered one by one, arriving separately to avoid drawing attention, sitting in a small clearing where they could see anyone approaching. The 10 black people formed a circle, their dark faces reflecting determination and hope and fear and courage. "Thank you for coming," Benjamin began quietly. "Thank you for trusting me enough to be here, for believing that change might be possible even in circumstances that seemed designed to prevent any change. I want to tell you what I'm proposing, and I want you to understand that you're free to walk away if this isn't something you can commit to. No judgment, no pressure. What I'm asking for is significant, and I need you to make that choice with full knowledge of what it means." He paused, letting his words settle, giving people space to absorb the weight of the moment. "I'm proposing that we organize a rebellion. Not the kind that attacks white people or tries to escape. Not the kind they've learned to watch for and crush. I'm proposing a rebellion of consciousness, of community, of collective will. I'm proposing that we build systems of support and resistance that exist underneath the plantation's visible operations, that transform how we think about ourselves and each other, that preserve our humanity and prepare us for freedom even if that freedom is years or decades away." Benjamin looked around the circle, meeting each person's eyes. "I'm proposing that we create an invisible nation within this plantation, a community that sustains itself spiritually and psychologically despite physical bondage, that maintains our connection to African roots, that passes knowledge to children, that supports each family so no one faces their suffering alone. I'm proposing that we organize so thoroughly, so carefully, so invisibly, that by the time white people realize what we've built, it will be too strong to destroy." Moses spoke first, his aged voice carrying wisdom earned through 4 decades of bondage. What you're describing is what our people have always done to survive, creating community despite efforts to isolate us, maintaining culture despite efforts to erase it, preserving humanity despite efforts to reduce us to property. You're just proposing we do it more intentionally, more completely, with more organization than before. Exactly, Benjamin confirmed. We've always resisted. I'm proposing we resist more strategically, more collectively, with clearer goals and better coordination. I'm proposing we transform scattered individual acts of resistance into a systematic movement that changes everything. Sarah leaned forward, her analytical mind working through implications. This would require extraordinary operational security. One person breaking under punishment, one person carelessly talking where whites might hear, and the entire structure collapses. Everyone here would be sold or worse. That's why we build carefully, Benjamin said. We grow slowly, adding people only when we're certain of their commitment and discretion. We use multiple layers of organization, so compromise of one part doesn't destroy the whole. We communicate through codes and symbols that white people won't recognize. We make the whole thing invisible by making it look like normal plantation life. Hannah spoke next, practical mind already thinking about logistics. How would this actually work? What would we organize? What would daily operations look like? Benjamin smiled, appreciating the question. We start with what we already have permission to do, then expand it in ways they don't notice. The communal gardens you already coordinate, Hannah? We expand that into food security system that ensures no black family goes hungry. The Sunday gatherings for prayer and singing. We use those to pass information and coordinate activities. The work crews I now supervise, we use those to identify and develop leadership across the plantation. Everything looks normal, but everything serves purposes beyond what white people understand. Jacob, the youngest and most impatient, voiced the question burning in him. But what's the end goal? If we're not fighting them directly, if we're not escaping, what are we actually trying to accomplish? How does this get us to freedom? Freedom isn't just about legal status, Benjamin replied thoughtfully. It's about consciousness, about community, about maintaining humanity. If we build strong enough systems, if we develop ourselves and our children thoroughly enough, then when opportunities for physical freedom arrive, we'll be ready. When slavery ends, and it will end someday, we won't be broken people who need to rebuild from nothing. We'll be organized communities with established leadership and support systems. We'll be ready to be truly free because we'll have been practicing freedom internally even while externally enslaved. And if slavery doesn't end in our lifetimes, Jacob pressed, then we'll have lived more fully human lives than slavery tried to permit, Benjamin answered. We'll have preserved culture and knowledge for our children. We'll have created community that sustained us through suffering. That matters, Jacob. That has value even if we never see legal freedom. Our resistance matters even if it doesn't immediately produce dramatic results. The conversation continued for 2 hours, each person asking questions, raising concerns, offering ideas, testing their understanding of what Benjamin proposed. By the end, all 10 people had committed to the project, understanding both its potential and its risks. They'd formed the founding council of what would become the most sophisticated underground resistance network in Virginia, though they didn't know that yet. They only knew they were tired of being passive, tired of being broken, ready to build something that honored their humanity. Over the following weeks, the council began implementing the first phase of Benjamin's plan. They started with simple, seemingly innocent activities that served multiple purposes. The communal garden coordination that Hannah managed became more sophisticated, expanding from vegetable plots into a system that ensured every family had adequate nutrition, that surplus was shared with those who needed it most, that food security became something the black community controlled rather than depending entirely on white provisions. This garden system also became the network's first communication mechanism. When someone needed to pass a message to another part of the plantation, they'd give vegetables as a gift that also carried coded information. Certain vegetables meant certain things. The way they were bundled conveyed messages. White people saw enslaved people sharing food and thought nothing of it. The network saw a sophisticated communication system operating in plain sight. Moses organized what appeared to be nothing more than Sunday prayer meetings and singing sessions, activities white people expected and even encouraged because they thought such gatherings reinforced submissive religious messages. But Moses transformed these gatherings into information exchange sessions, teaching sessions, coordination meetings disguised as worship. Songs contained double meanings that black people understood but white people missed. Biblical stories about liberation were emphasized over those about obedience. The meetings strengthened community bonds while appearing to white observation like exactly what slave owners wanted. Sarah began what she called reading sessions, where she'd observe white people carefully and teach other network members how to predict their behavior, how to manipulate their perceptions, how to appear to be what they expected while actually being something entirely different. White people see what they expect to see, Sarah explained. If we show them obedient slaves going through familiar routines, they don't look deeper. We can hide entire worlds underneath their expectations. Benjamin used his official position as crew leader to identify additional people for recruitment. He watched how various individuals handled stress, how they responded to injustice, how they related to others. He noted those who showed leadership potential, those who had valuable skills, those who demonstrated the intelligence and character necessary for the network's work. But he recruited slowly, carefully, never rushing the process, even when impatience urged speed. After 3 months, the network had grown from the founding 10 to 25 carefully selected members. These 25 were organized into 5 teams of 5, each team with a designated leader who reported to Benjamin. This cellular structure meant that if one team was compromised, the others could continue operating. It also meant that most members only knew the 5 people in their team plus Benjamin, limiting the damage that could occur if someone broke under interrogation. Each team had a specific focus. One team managed the expanded food security system. Another coordinated the spiritual/cultural gatherings. A third focused on education, secretly teaching reading and literacy skills to adults and children despite Virginia laws prohibiting black literacy. A fourth team worked on what they called psychological resistance, teaching people how to maintain mental and spiritual freedom despite physical bondage. The fifth team focused on intelligence gathering, collecting information about the plantation's operations, about white people's plans, about opportunities and threats. The education team, led by a brilliant young black woman named Ruth, created ingenious methods for teaching literacy without detection. They used sticks to draw letters in dirt, creating temporary writing that could be erased instantly. They carved letters into wood chips that could be hidden or destroyed quickly. They taught through games that looked like children playing but actually conveyed reading and math skills. Adults learned alongside children, entire families gradually becoming literate while white people remained completely unaware. Literacy is freedom, Ruth explained to her students. Not immediate freedom, not legal freedom, but freedom of mind and spirit. When you can read, you can access ideas and knowledge that slavery tries to keep from you. You can understand the documents that define your legal status. You can learn about the world beyond this plantation. You can teach your children what white people insist black children can't learn. Every word you read is an act of resistance. The psychological resistance team, led by an older black man named Elijah, taught what Benjamin called double consciousness, long before W.E.B. Du Bois would name it. They taught people how to maintain separate internal and external selves, how to appear to submit while internally rejecting slavery's legitimacy, how to protect their sense of self-worth from the constant dehumanization they faced. They taught that external compliance didn't require internal acceptance, that playing roles for white people didn't define who they truly were. They want to own not just our bodies, but our minds and spirits, Elijah said during one of his teaching sessions. They want us to believe we're inferior, to accept our enslavement as natural, to internalize their lies about us. Psychological resistance means refusing that. It means maintaining your dignity internally, even while externally appearing to accept their authority. It means knowing that you're fully human no matter what they say or do. By the fall of 1856, the network had grown to 50 members and was operating with increasing sophistication. They'd created systems for sharing resources, for supporting families facing crises, for teaching children, for maintaining African cultural traditions, for coordinating resistance activities. And they'd done all this while appearing to white observers like nothing more than an efficiently functioning work crew that happened to be unusually cooperative and productive. Thomas Brennan, the overseer, noticed that something had changed among the enslaved workers, though he couldn't identify what exactly. They seemed more organized, more unified, more confident in subtle ways he found troubling. Work productivity had actually increased, which pleased Carter, but Brennan's instincts warned him that increased efficiency among slaves often preceded rebellion. He began watching more carefully, looking for signs of coordination or planning, suspicious of the very cooperation that Carter praised. One October evening, Brennan decided to investigate the Sunday gatherings that Moses led. He hid near the meeting location, watching and listening, trying to catch evidence of seditious planning. What he saw and heard appeared entirely innocuous. Enslaved people singing spirituals, praying, sharing food, conversing about daily matters. Nothing that suggested organized resistance, nothing that violated any plantation rules or Virginia laws. But Brennan's suspicions remained. He couldn't articulate what bothered him, couldn't point to specific evidence of wrongdoing, but he felt certain that something was happening that he wasn't seeing. He reported his concerns to Carter, who dismissed them as paranoia. "Brennan, they're more productive than they've ever been," Carter said with exasperation. "Benjamin has organized his crew brilliantly. The other workers are following that example. We're seeing increased yields, fewer discipline problems, better cooperation. Why are you looking for problems where there aren't any?" "Because slaves don't become more cooperative without reason," Brennan insisted. "In my experience, when they start organizing themselves, even in ways that appear beneficial to us, there's usually an ulterior purpose. I think we should break up these Sunday meetings, separate the crew leaders from regular workers, sell off the ones who seem to have too much influence." "You want me to break up profitable operations and sell valuable workers because you have a vague feeling that something might be wrong?" Carter shook his head. "No, we're not destroying what's working based on unfounded suspicions. If you find actual evidence of planning or escape, we'll act. Until then, let the operations continue as they are." Brennan backed down, but he increased his surveillance, watched for any concrete evidence that would justify the crackdown he felt was necessary. Benjamin, informed of Brennan's increased attention through the network's intelligence gathering, made the decision to slow expansion and focus on deepening the existing organization. Better to consolidate what they'd built than risk exposure through overly ambitious growth. The network entered a period of careful restraint, maintaining their activities but adding no new members, taking no new risks. They used this time to train their existing members more thoroughly, to strengthen bonds within and between teams, to refine their operational security procedures. Benjamin also used this period to begin documenting their work, not in writing, which would be far too dangerous, but through story and song, through oral traditions that would preserve their methods and philosophy for future generations. During this careful phase, an event occurred that tested the network's strength and Benjamin's leadership. One of the network members, a young man named Samuel, was caught by Brennan attempting to teach his daughter to recognize letters using wood chips with carved symbols. Brennan didn't realize the symbols were letters, thought Samuel was simply playing with carved wood. But he decided to punish the activity anyway because it represented enslaved people taking initiative without white authorization. The punishment was brutal, 20 lashes delivered publicly to make an example. Samuel endured the whipping without revealing anything about the network's educational activities or broader organization. But the event traumatized his young daughter, who'd been forced to watch, and sent fear through the network. If Brennan had realized Samuel was teaching literacy, the punishment would have been far worse, possibly fatal. That evening, the network's leadership council met in emergency session. Jacob was furious, wanting to retaliate against Brennan somehow to punish this white man who'd brutalized Samuel for the crime of teaching his daughter. Others were frightened, wondering if they should suspend all activities until Brennan's suspicions faded. The group was fractured, unified purpose threatened by fear and anger. Benjamin listened to all perspectives, then spoke with the authority he'd earned over months of careful leadership. What happened to Samuel is exactly why we do this work. He was punished for teaching his daughter because they fear educated black people. They fear black parents having authority over their own children's development. They fear anything that suggests we're fully human with our own purposes beyond serving them. Samuel's suffering reminds us why resistance matters, why building this network matters, why we can't let fear stop us. He paused, letting people absorb his words. But Jacob, retaliating against Brennan, would destroy everything we've built. It would confirm his suspicions, would bring down violence on the entire community, would end our network before we've accomplished anything lasting. We don't resist through individual acts of revenge that feel satisfying but accomplish nothing strategic. We resist through systematic organization that actually changes conditions. So, we do nothing?
Jacob demanded angrily. Samuel is suffering, his daughter is traumatized, and we just accept it? We don't accept it, Benjamin corrected. We respond strategically rather than reactively. We support Samuel's family through our resource-sharing network. We continue teaching, including Samuel's daughter, showing her that her father's suffering had purpose because education continues. We make Brennan's brutality meaningless by persisting despite it. That's how we resist. That's how we win. Sarah spoke up, supporting Benjamin's approach. If we retaliate, we let Brennan define the terms of engagement. He wants us to respond violently because he knows how to crush violent resistance. We've been operating differently, building something he can't see or understand. We need to maintain that approach even when it's emotionally difficult. The council eventually accepted Benjamin's guidance, though Jacob remained frustrated with what he saw as insufficient response. The network continued operating, supporting Samuel's family, continuing their educational activities more carefully, refusing to let Brennan's violence intimidate them into abandoning their purpose. This incident became a turning point in the network's development. It demonstrated that they could maintain operational security under pressure, that they could support each other through crises, that they could persist despite fear and anger. It also clarified for everyone involved that they were engaged in genuine resistance with real consequences, not just theoretical organizing. By early 1857, the network had weathered its first major crisis and emerged stronger. The 50 members were now thoroughly trained, deeply committed, operating with extraordinary coordination. Benjamin decided it was time to expand again, to bring the network to its full potential scope. Over the following 6 months, carefully and methodically, they recruited until the network encompassed 100 members, nearly 3/4 of the adult enslaved population on the Carter plantation. This expansion required creating additional organizational layers. The 5 original teams became the core leadership, each of which supervised 4 sub-teams of 5 people each. This created a structure where information flowed from Benjamin to the 5 core leaders to 20 team leaders to 80 general members. Most people knew only their immediate team and their team leader, limiting exposure if any individual was compromised. The expanded network operated with remarkable sophistication. They'd created what was essentially a parallel society existing underneath the plantation's official operations. They had their own communication systems, their own resource-sharing mechanisms, their own educational programs, their own cultural preservation activities, their own decision-making processes.
They appeared to white observers as nothing more than efficiently organized work crews. But they were actually an organized community practicing collective self-governance while legally enslaved. One of their most powerful initiatives was what they called the Remembering Project. Led by Moses, who possessed extraordinary knowledge of family histories and African traditions, this project systematically documented every family's ancestry, preserved stories about African homelands, and maintained knowledge about cultural practices that slavery tried to erase. They couldn't write this information down, so they encoded it in songs, stories, ritual practices that would be passed forward through generations. "They want us to forget where we came from," Moses explained to a group gathered for a remembering session. "They want us to have no identity except what they've assigned us, no history except bondage, no culture except what they permit." The Remembering Project fights that erasure. When we maintain knowledge about our African roots, about our ancestors, about our cultures, we maintain connection to our humanity. We remember that we weren't always enslaved, that our people built kingdoms and cities, that we come from freedom even though we're currently in bondage. The network also created support systems that addressed practical needs slavery tried to ignore. When families faced food shortages, the Resource Sharing Network provided assistance. When children needed care while parents worked, the community organized childcare collectives. When people faced emotional or spiritual crises, trained supporters provided counseling and help. When skills needed to be learned, experienced members taught them. The network functioned like a government, providing services to its citizens, except its citizens were legally property and its government was invisible to those who claimed to own it. By the summer of 1857, the network had been operating for over a year and had transformed life for enslaved people on the Carter plantation in ways that were profound but largely invisible to white observers. Black families felt more secure because they had community support. Black children were receiving education that would prepare them for eventual freedom. Black culture and African traditions were being preserved rather than erased. And Black people were maintaining psychological and spiritual autonomy despite physical bondage. But the network's greatest accomplishment was something less tangible but even more important. They'd proven that sophisticated, organized resistance was possible, that enslaved people could build complex systems right under their oppressors' noses, that intelligence and strategic thinking could accomplish what force couldn't. They demonstrated that the most effective rebellion wasn't necessarily the most visible one. James Carter remained completely unaware that anything unusual was happening on his plantation. He saw productive workers who seemed content enough, efficient operations that generated good profits, a smoothly running enterprise that required less of his direct intervention than before Benjamin's appointment as crew leader. He congratulated himself on his progressive management approach, never realizing that his progressive approach was simply providing cover for organized resistance he couldn't imagine. Thomas Brennan remained suspicious, but couldn't identify specific evidence to support his instincts. He watched the Sunday gatherings and saw nothing but prayer and singing. He observed Benjamin's leadership and saw nothing but effective work coordination. He noted the cooperation among enslaved workers and saw nothing but improved efficiency. Everything appeared normal, even though Brennan's gut told him something was wrong. His inability to see what was actually happening demonstrated the brilliance of Benjamin's approach, hiding resistance inside expected behaviors, making the revolutionary look ordinary.
But in September 1857, an external event occurred that would test the network more severely than anything internal had. News spread through Virginia's black community about a planned uprising in a neighboring state, a violent rebellion that was being organized by enslaved people who were tired of waiting for gradual change. The rebellion was still in planning stages, but word was spreading through invisible networks that connected enslaved people across state lines. The news reached the Carter plantation through those same networks, carried by traveling black people who moved between plantations. Benjamin learned about the planned rebellion and immediately convened his core leadership council to discuss how to respond. The situation was complex. A rebellion in a neighboring state would bring heightened scrutiny and violence to black communities everywhere, would make their own work more dangerous, might destroy what they'd built if authorities began systematic crackdowns on any black organizing. "We need to distance ourselves from this," Sarah said immediately. "If violent rebellion happens nearby, every plantation in Virginia will face increased surveillance. They'll be looking for any sign of coordination among slaves. Our network would be discovered and destroyed." "Maybe that's worth it if the rebellion succeeds," Jacob argued. "Maybe violent action is what's actually needed. Maybe our careful organizing is just a way of avoiding the real confrontation that has to happen." "Violent rebellions have never succeeded," Moses said quietly. "I've seen 3 attempted in my lifetime. All were crushed brutally. All resulted in mass deaths of black people. All led to harsher laws and worse conditions. Violence might feel like stronger resistance, but it accomplishes nothing except more suffering." "But we can't just do nothing while other black people try to free themselves," Jacob insisted. "Don't we have an obligation to support resistance in whatever form it takes?" Benjamin had been listening carefully, understanding the impossible position they faced. "We have obligations to our own community first," he said finally. "To the 100 people who've trusted us with their safety, who've joined our network believing in our approach. We can't risk their destruction to support a rebellion we don't control and that history suggests won't succeed. But we also can't pretend we don't know about it, can't ignore what other enslaved people are risking." He thought for a moment longer, then continued. "Here's what we do. We send warning through our networks to people in that neighboring state. We share what we know about why violent rebellion typically fails, about the reprisals that follow, about alternative approaches that might be more effective. We offer what wisdom we can while respecting that those people will make their own decisions. But we don't participate directly, and we take extra security precautions here to ensure our network isn't compromised by whatever happens there." "So we warn them but don't help them?" Jacob said, frustration clear in his voice. "We help them by sharing hard truths about what works and what doesn't," Benjamin replied. "We help them by preserving our network so that if their rebellion fails, there's still organized resistance happening somewhere. We help them by surviving to continue the work. That's the help we can actually provide." The council debated for hours, but ultimately accepted Benjamin's approach. They sent messages through their networks offering strategic advice to those planning rebellion, while preparing their own network for the increased scrutiny that would follow, regardless of whether that rebellion happened. They suspended some of their more visible activities, reduced meeting frequencies, emphasized to all members the critical importance of operational security. The planned rebellion in the neighboring state ultimately didn't happen. Enough warnings reached the organizers, enough people counseled against it that the plans were abandoned before execution. Virginia authorities never learned how close they'd come to facing coordinated uprising. But the episode demonstrated how connected black resistance networks were across wide geographic areas, how information and ideas spread through communities despite white efforts to keep enslaved people isolated. The near rebellion also forced Benjamin and his leadership council to confront difficult questions about their approach. Were they doing enough? Was strategic, invisible resistance truly effective, or just a rationalization for avoiding riskier action? How did they balance patience with urgency, caution with courage, community safety with moral imperatives? These questions came to a head in a private conversation between Benjamin and Jacob one evening.
The young man had been struggling with the network's cautious approach, feeling it was insufficient response to the enormity of slavery's evil. "I respect what you've built," Jacob said to Benjamin, "but sometimes I wonder if we're just making slavery more tolerable rather than actually fighting it. We're helping people survive bondage rather than ending bondage. Is that really resistance, or is it collaboration?" Benjamin understood Jacob's frustration because he'd felt similar doubts himself. "I ask myself those questions constantly," he admitted. "I wonder if we should be doing more, taking bigger risks, aiming for immediate freedom rather than long-term transformation. But then I remember what violent resistance typically accomplishes: dead black people and harsher conditions for survivors. I remember that most escape attempts fail. I remember that dramatic gestures might feel more like resistance, but accomplish less than patient organizing." "So we just accept slavery?" Jacob challenged. "We never accept slavery," Benjamin said firmly. "But we recognize that effective resistance requires matching our strategies to our actual circumstances. We're 100 people on a plantation, surrounded by a society built entirely on keeping us enslaved. Violent rebellion would be crushed in hours. Mass escape would fail, with most of us captured or killed. But organized community building, education, cultural preservation, psychological resistance, preparing for eventual freedom, those are things we can actually accomplish. Those create real change, even if it's not immediate freedom." "But what if slavery never ends?" Jacob pressed. "What if all our preparation is for a freedom that never comes?" "Then we'll still have lived more fully human lives," Benjamin replied. "We'll still have preserved our culture, educated our children, supported each other, maintained our dignity. That has value, Jacob. That matters, even if legal freedom is generations away. The quality of our lives in bondage matters. The humanity we preserve matters. The community we build matters. Don't dismiss those accomplishments just because they're not dramatic." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, processing Benjamin's words. "I understand what you're saying. I do. But it's hard to be patient when you've never known a day of freedom, when you watch children born into the same bondage you've suffered your whole life, when you know that white people are getting rich from our stolen labor. It's hard to stay strategic when anger and urgency are pulling at you." "I know," Benjamin said with empathy. "I feel that too, every day. But I channel that anger into building something lasting rather than into actions that would feel satisfying but accomplish nothing. That's the discipline this work requires. That's the sacrifice we make. Not the sacrifice of our lives in dramatic rebellion, but the sacrifice of immediate gratification in favor of long-term effectiveness." This conversation reflected ongoing tensions within the network between those who wanted bolder action and those who favored Benjamin's patient approach. Benjamin managed these tensions through inclusive leadership, allowing dissenting voices to be heard, incorporating good ideas regardless of their source, explaining his reasoning while remaining open to changing course if better approaches emerged. This leadership style maintained unity while permitting healthy debate that strengthened rather than fractured the network. By late 1857, the network had reached its mature form. 100 members organized into cellular structure, operating sophisticated systems for communication, resource sharing, education, cultural preservation, psychological support, and intelligence gathering.
They'd created parallel governance that provided services to the black community while remaining invisible to white authorities. They demonstrated that organized resistance could exist and thrive right underneath their oppressors' observation. But Benjamin knew the network's greatest test was still ahead. They'd built extraordinary organizational capacity, but they hadn't yet faced the moment when that capacity would be fully challenged. That moment arrived in the winter of 1858, when James Carter made a decision that threatened to destroy everything the network had built. Carter faced financial pressures from bad investments and declining tobacco prices. He needed to raise capital quickly, and the solution he chose was the same one many plantation owners resorted to: selling enslaved people. Carter planned to sell 30 people to a trader who would transport them to the Deep South's brutal cotton plantations, where life expectancy was measured in years rather than decades. The 30 people marked for sale included several network members, including Hannah, one of the founding council members whose organizational genius had been crucial to building their resource-sharing systems. If these sales went through, families would be destroyed, the network would be significantly weakened, and years of careful building would be partially undone. Benjamin learned about Carter's plans through the intelligence gathering team, which had overheard conversations between Carter and the slave trader. The network's leadership council met in emergency session to determine how to respond. They faced their most significant crisis: how to prevent these sales without revealing the network's existence or triggering violent reprisals that could destroy their community. "We can't let them sell Hannah and the others," Sarah said urgently. "The network wouldn't survive losing that much leadership and organizational capacity. But I don't see how we stop legal slave sales without exposing ourselves or committing acts that would bring down violence on everyone." "Could we sabotage his finances somehow?" Jacob suggested. "Make him not need the money from selling people." "How?"
Moses asked practically. "We don't control his investments. We can't conjure money for him. His financial problems are beyond our influence." "Then maybe we need to make him see that selling these specific people is bad business," Benjamin said thoughtfully. "Make him understand that he'll lose more value than he'll gain, that there are better solutions to his financial problems that don't require destroying families and disrupting operations." "How do we communicate that to him without revealing that we know about his plans?" Hannah asked. "How do we influence his decision without him realizing he's being influenced?" "The same way we've done everything else," Benjamin replied. "Through careful manipulation of his perceptions, through orchestrating situations that lead him to conclusions we want him to reach, through making our solutions look like his ideas. We've been practicing these techniques for 2 years. Now we use them for the highest stakes challenge we faced." What followed was the most intense 10 days of strategic planning and psychological manipulation the network had ever attempted. They had to change Carter's decision without him realizing he was being influenced, without exposing the network's existence, without triggering Brennan's already heightened suspicions. It required coordinating multiple teams, executing complex plans with precise timing, maintaining perfect operational security while working at unprecedented speed. Benjamin used his position as crew leader to arrange for Carter to witness several coincidental demonstrations of the productivity and value of the people marked for sale. Hannah's organizational work with the gardens suddenly produced surplus crops at just the right moment to remind Carter how efficient those systems were. Moses arranged for a Sunday gathering that Carter happened to observe, where the community cohesion and cooperation were on full display, in ways that reminded Carter that his plantation ran smoothly because of established community structures that would be disrupted by major sales. Sarah orchestrated multiple overheard conversations, where Carter was exposed to information supporting the idea that selling productive workers would reduce his plantation's value more than the sales would help his financial situation.
The intelligence team discovered that one of Carter's recent bad investments might be salvageable with proper management, and they arranged for that information to reach him through channels that appeared completely legitimate. The network also did something extraordinarily risky. They used their literacy skills to create a forged letter that appeared to be from a plantation management expert addressing general plantation financial strategy.
The letter was carefully designed to look like something Carter had ordered and forgotten about, and it strongly advised against selling productive workers during financial difficulties, arguing that maintaining productive capacity was crucial to long-term profitability. The letter was placed in Carter's office in ways that made it appear it had been misfiled and recently rediscovered. Meanwhile, Benjamin took an enormous personal risk. He approached Carter directly, ostensibly to discuss work assignments, but subtly guided the conversation toward plantation productivity and efficiency. "Master Carter," Benjamin said carefully, "I've noticed some inefficiencies in how we're organizing work that I think could be improved if you'd permit some adjustments. If we reorganized certain teams and changed some timing patterns, I believe we could increase tobacco yields by 15 to 20% without requiring additional workers or working anyone harder." Carter was interested immediately. What kind of reorganization? Benjamin outlined a plan he'd been developing for months, a plan that genuinely would improve efficiency if implemented. "But it would only work if the current team structures remain intact," Benjamin added carefully. "The productivity gains come from established working relationships and cooperation patterns that have developed. Major disruptions to team composition would eliminate those advantages." This was the critical moment where Benjamin was planting the idea that selling people would disrupt productivity in ways that outweighed financial gains. He was doing it subtly enough that Carter would think the insight was his own rather than something a slave had suggested. Carter considered Benjamin's proposal seriously. These efficiency improvements, how quickly could they be implemented? If we started immediately and had stable team composition, we'd see yield increases within one planting cycle, but only if teams remain stable. That's crucial to the whole approach. Carter nodded thoughtfully, dismissing Benjamin to consider the implications. Benjamin left uncertain whether his strategy had worked, whether he'd done enough to change Carter's decision without revealing the network's hand. Over the following days, Carter was exposed to multiple sources of information, all pointing toward the same conclusion: that selling workers to address short-term financial pressure would damage long-term profitability, that better solutions existed, that his current workforce's productivity was higher than he'd realized. The network had orchestrated a comprehensive campaign of subtle influence, bombarding Carter with perspectives that all supported not proceeding with the planned sales. The campaign worked. Carter postponed the sales indefinitely, deciding to try Benjamin's efficiency improvements first, to see if the salvageable investment could be recovered, to explore other financial options before resorting to selling productive workers who generated ongoing value. The network had achieved what seemed impossible. They'd influenced a major plantation management decision in ways that protected their community and their structure. The victory sent waves of hope and validation through the network. They'd proven they could accomplish something truly significant, that their strategic approach could achieve results that direct confrontation couldn't. But the victory also brought increased attention. Brennan had noticed Carter consulting with Benjamin unusually often, had observed various coincidences that seemed orchestrated even though he couldn't prove coordination. "Something is wrong," Brennan told Carter after the sales were canceled. "Too many things are falling into place too conveniently. The slave Benjamin suddenly has productivity improvements exactly when you need financial solutions. Information appears exactly when you need it. I think they're manipulating you, organizing in ways we're not seeing." "You're being paranoid again," Carter replied, though with less certainty than before. "Benjamin made good suggestions because he's intelligent and experienced. That's why I made him crew leader. Am I supposed to ignore good ideas because they come from a slave?" "I'm saying we should investigate more carefully," Brennan insisted. "We should separate Benjamin from his crew, interrogate some of them privately, break up their gatherings, see what we find."
You want to break up productive operations based on suspicions, Carter said? The same suspicions you had last year that turned out to be nothing? The suspicions I had last year that I couldn't prove, Brennan corrected. That doesn't mean I was wrong. That might mean they're better at hiding than I am at finding. Carter ultimately rejected Brennan's suggestions for immediate investigation, but he agreed to increased monitoring. The overseer was authorized to watch more carefully, to investigate anything suspicious, to report regularly on any signs of coordination among enslaved workers. The network had won the battle over the sales, but they'd also drawn dangerous attention that could lead to their eventual exposure. Benjamin recognized the increased danger and made crucial decisions about the network's future operation. They would reduce the frequency of activities, maintain only essential operations, focus on preservation rather than expansion. "We've accomplished what we set out to do," he told the Leadership Council. "We've built an organized community that exists underneath slavery's surface, that maintains our humanity, that prepares us for eventual freedom. We've proven it can be done."
Now, our job is to preserve what we've built, to pass it forward to the next generation, to ensure it survives even if current circumstances make it too dangerous to expand further. "So we go into hiding?" Jacob asked, disappointed. "We go into sustainable operation mode," Benjamin corrected. "We maintain everything crucial, we continue our education and cultural preservation work, but we reduce visibility, take fewer risks, prioritize survival over growth. This is a long-term movement. It doesn't fail if we have periods of caution. It only fails if we're discovered and destroyed." The network operated in this reduced visibility mode through 1858 and into 1859, maintaining essential activities while avoiding anything that might trigger Brennan's investigations. They continued teaching literacy, continued resource sharing, continued their psychological resistance work, but they did it with even greater care about operational security, with even more attention to ensuring nothing appeared unusual to white observation. During this period of caution, Benjamin began focusing on something he'd been planning for years, creating a method to pass the network's knowledge and methods to future generations. He couldn't write it down. Written evidence would be far too dangerous. But he could encode it in stories, songs, ritual practices that would carry the essential information forward even if the current network was eventually discovered and broken. Working with Moses and the elders, Benjamin created what they called the teaching stories, narratives that appeared to be simple folk tales but actually contained sophisticated information about organizing resistance, about maintaining operational security, about building community under oppression, about strategic thinking and psychological resistance. These stories were taught to children as entertainment, passed between adults as cultural tradition, but they carried crucial knowledge that could be decoded by future generations who needed it. "What we're creating will survive beyond us," Moses explained to a group learning the teaching stories. "Even if they destroy this network, even if they sell every one of us away, these stories will persist. Children who hear them will absorb lessons about resistance without even knowing that's what they're learning. And someday, when they're adults facing their own struggles, they'll remember these stories and understand what they really mean. We're planting seeds that might not grow for generations, but they will grow." The network also began training the next generation of leaders, identifying young people who showed potential and teaching them skills they'd need to continue the work. Sarah worked with several teenage girls who showed her own gifts for psychological insight, teaching them how to read situations and people, how to predict reactions, how to influence outcomes subtly. Hannah trained younger women in organizational logistics, passing forward her methods for coordinating complex activities invisibly. Benjamin worked with promising young men like Jacob, teaching them strategic thinking, leadership skills, decision-making under pressure. "You're inheriting something extraordinary," Benjamin told the young leaders during one training session. "You're inheriting a tradition of resistance that your parents and grandparents built, a tradition of maintaining humanity despite dehumanization, of organizing despite oppression, of preparing for freedom while enslaved.
Your responsibility is to carry that forward, to add your own contributions to it, to pass it to your children. This is multi-generational work. It doesn't end with us. It continues through you and through every generation that follows. In late 1859, external events once again impacted the network in ways they couldn't control. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, though it failed militarily, sent shockwaves through Virginia and the entire South. White people became more paranoid about slave insurrection, more vigilant about any black organizing, more brutal in suppressing anything that could possibly be interpreted as resistance. The raid vindicated Brennan's warnings about the dangers of organized slaves, made Carter more receptive to the overseer's concerns, increased surveillance across all Virginia plantations. The network had to go into near hibernation mode. They suspended most activities, maintained only the absolute essentials, told all members to avoid any behavior that might seem unusual. The increased scrutiny made their work nearly impossible temporarily, but it also demonstrated why they'd built cellular structures. Even with some teams completely inactive, others could continue crucial functions, ensuring the network's core purposes persisted. This period of intense pressure tested everyone's commitment and patience. Months went by with minimal activity, with constant fear that they'd be discovered despite their cautions, with frustration at not being able to continue their work openly. Some members wondered if the network had been a failed experiment, if the risks hadn't been worth the limited results. But Benjamin and the core leadership remained confident that what they'd built mattered, that it would persist beyond current difficulties, that survival through this crisis would demonstrate the network's durability. By mid-1860, the immediate crisis of post-Harper's Ferry paranoia had begun to fade. White vigilance remained higher than before, but it was no longer at panic levels. The network began cautiously resuming activities, testing what was possible in the new normal, adjusting their methods to account for heightened surveillance. They discovered that education could continue if they were even more careful about methods. Resource sharing could continue because it appeared like normal mutual assistance that slave communities had always provided. Cultural preservation could continue through music and story that white people didn't understand. The network could survive and function, just with more constraints than before. But then, in November 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president, and everything changed. South Carolina seceded from the Union in December, followed by other Southern states. Virginia debated whether to join the Confederacy. The nation was moving towards civil war, toward a conflict that would ultimately determine slavery's future. The network watched these developments with a mixture of hope and fear, understanding that enormous changes were coming, but uncertain what those changes would mean for them specifically. Benjamin called the Leadership Council together in January 1861 to discuss how the network should respond to the developing crisis. "We're entering a period of chaos and change," he told them. "Slavery's future is being decided by forces beyond our plantation, beyond our control. Our network can't determine whether slavery ends or continues, but we can determine how prepared we are for whatever comes. If war comes, if slavery ends, we need to be ready," Sarah said. "We need to have leadership in place, organizational structures ready to function openly, educated people who can take advantage of opportunities. Everything we've built has been preparing for this moment, even though we didn't know when it would come." "And if slavery doesn't end," Jacob asked, still skeptical despite years of participation. "If the South wins a war, if slavery continues, was all this worth the risk?" "Yes," Benjamin said firmly. "Even if slavery continues in our lifetimes, we'll have lived more fully human lives because of what we built. We'll have maintained our culture, educated our children, supported our families, practiced freedom internally, even while externally enslaved. That has value regardless of what happens politically. But I believe change is coming. I believe we'll see slavery's end. And when that happens, we'll be ready because of the work we've done." The Civil War began in April 1861. Virginia joined the Confederacy. The Carter plantation, like all Southern farms and plantations, was immediately impacted by the war's demands. White men enlisted in Confederate armies. Labor was redirected to war production. Resources became scarce. Normal operations were disrupted. These disruptions created new opportunities for the network. With fewer white people present to supervise, with attention focused on the war rather than internal plantation security, with the entire social structure destabilized, the network could operate more freely than ever before. They intensified their education efforts, teaching literacy to dozens more people, while Confederate authorities were distracted.
They expanded their cultural preservation work, recognizing that war's chaos might destroy communities and that maintaining cultural knowledge was more important than ever. The network also began preparing for freedom more directly. They created plans for how land could be distributed among formerly enslaved families. They identified people with leadership skills who could represent the black community in negotiations with whatever governments emerged after the war. They practiced making collective decisions, preparing for self-governance. They transformed from a resistance network into something more like a proto-government, ready to assume open leadership when circumstances permitted. Thomas Brennan was one of the white men who enlisted in Confederate armies. His departure removed the network's most suspicious observer, the person who'd come closest to detecting their organization. Without Brennan's vigilant oversight, the network could operate with significantly more freedom, could accelerate activities that had been constrained by his presence. By 1863, with the Emancipation Proclamation declaring enslaved people in Confederate states to be free, the network's purpose began shifting from covert resistance to open community organization. Union forces hadn't reached their part of Virginia yet, so they remained technically enslaved under Confederate control. But everyone understood that slavery's end was approaching. Benjamin used this transition period to begin teaching network members how to operate openly, how to advocate for their community's interests with government authorities, how to negotiate from positions of relative powerlessness but with clear demands and unity. When freedom comes legally, we'll face new challenges, he explained. White people won't suddenly accept us as equals. They'll try to create new forms of oppression. We need to be organized enough to resist those efforts, to demand real freedom rather than just nominal freedom. When Union forces finally reached their area in 1864, slavery officially ended on the Carter plantation. The network that had operated in secret for 8 years could finally function openly. The 100 members, now trained and experienced in collective organization, became the black community's official leadership, negotiating with Freedmen's Bureau officials, organizing labor cooperatives, establishing schools, creating governance structures. The transition from enslaved to free was complex and difficult, full of challenges the network hadn't anticipated. But because they'd been preparing for years, because they'd already developed leadership and organizational capacity, because they'd maintained their humanity and dignity despite bondage, they were better positioned to navigate freedom than communities that hadn't done similar work. Benjamin Clarke was 42 years old when slavery officially ended. He'd spent 8 years organizing a rebellion that no one had noticed until it was far too late to stop. He'd transformed a plantation's enslaved population from isolated individuals into an organized community. He demonstrated that the most effective resistance wasn't necessarily the most visible, that patient strategic work could accomplish what dramatic gestures couldn't, that preserving humanity and preparing for freedom mattered even when freedom seemed impossibly distant. In 1865, shortly after the war ended, a journalist from a northern newspaper visited the former Carter plantation, researching how formerly enslaved people were managing the transition to freedom. He was struck by how organized the black community was, how effectively they'd established schools and cooperatives and governance structures. He asked Benjamin how they'd managed to organize so quickly after emancipation. "We didn't organize quickly," Benjamin replied with a slight smile. "We organized slowly and carefully over many years. We just did it invisibly, building everything underneath slavery's surface. By the time slavery ended, we'd been practicing freedom internally for years. We were ready because we'd been preparing even when preparation seemed pointless." "You organized resistance while enslaved?" the journalist asked, intrigued. "How did you avoid detection?" "We understood that the most effective rebellion is the one your oppressors never notice until it's too late to stop," Benjamin explained. "We didn't attack them directly. We built parallel systems that strengthened our community, preserved our humanity, maintained our dignity. We educated ourselves despite laws against literacy. We maintained African cultural traditions despite efforts to erase them. We practiced collective decision-making despite being property. We rebelled by refusing to be broken, by maintaining our full humanity, by preparing for a freedom we might never see." "That's remarkable," the journalist said. "You organized revolution through ordinary activities." "We organized revolution by understanding that resistance takes many forms," Benjamin corrected. "Physical rebellion, escape, those are visible resistance. But psychological resistance, cultural preservation, education, community building, these are equally important forms of resistance. They're just harder to see, harder to crush, more sustainable over long periods. That's what we did. We resisted invisibly but completely." The journalist's article about Benjamin's network was published in several northern newspapers in 1865. Other formerly enslaved communities read it and recognized elements of their own resistance work, their own invisible rebellions. The article helped document that enslaved people had never been passive victims, but had constantly resisted in countless ways, many of which remained invisible to white observers then and to historians later. Benjamin lived until 1891, dying at age 69, having seen slavery's end, Reconstruction's promise and disappointment, and the beginning of Jim Crow. He spent his post-slavery years teaching, organizing, and documenting the resistance strategies that had worked. He trained younger generations in the methods he developed, helping them adapt those methods to new forms of oppression. He wrote down the teaching stories, making sure they'd be preserved for future generations even though he couldn't safely write them during slavery. His network's members scattered across Virginia and beyond after emancipation, but they carried the lessons they'd learned with them. They established schools, built churches, created businesses, organized politically, all using skills they developed in the invisible network. They passed the teaching stories to their children and grandchildren, ensuring that knowledge about organizing resistance would persist across generations. The organizational methods Benjamin developed influenced later resistance movements, though often without direct acknowledgement. The cellular structures, the coded communications, the focus on psychological resistance and cultural preservation, the understanding that effective rebellion often happens invisibly, these approaches appeared in various forms in 20th century civil rights organizing, in anti-colonial movements, in resistance efforts worldwide. But Benjamin's greatest legacy wasn't his specific methods. It was the demonstration that human dignity cannot be destroyed by oppression, that communities can maintain humanity despite dehumanization, that intelligence and strategic thinking can achieve what force cannot, that patient organizing can accomplish revolutionary change, that resistance can happen in ways oppressors never notice until it's too late to stop. The story of Benjamin Clarke and his invisible rebellion reminds us of profound truths about human resilience and the nature of freedom. Oppression can control bodies, but cannot ultimately control minds and spirits. Systems can restrict behavior, but cannot prevent people from thinking, learning, organizing, preparing for better futures. The most effective resistance often happens in spaces that power doesn't monitor because it doesn't imagine resistance could occur there. Benjamin understood that rebellion isn't just about attacking your oppressors. It's about refusing to be what they claim you are, maintaining your humanity despite dehumanization, organizing communities despite efforts to atomize people into isolated property, educating yourself despite prohibitions,
preserving culture despite erasure efforts, preparing for freedom even when freedom seems impossibly distant. His network proved that enslaved people were never passive victims, but active agents of their own resistance.
They used every tool available: intelligence, organization, cultural knowledge, psychological insight, strategic thinking, collective solidarity. They built institutions and practices that sustained them through bondage and positioned them for freedom. They demonstrated that resistance is constant, multifaceted, often invisible to those who hold power. The story also illuminates truths about effective organizing that remain relevant. Change requires patience alongside urgency, strategic thinking alongside courage, attention to community safety alongside moral commitment to justice. Building sustainable movements requires cellular structures that can survive partial compromise, multiple layers of leadership that can continue functioning if top leaders are removed, operational security that protects participants, cultural preservation that maintains identity, education that develops capacity, mutual support that sustains people through hardship. Benjamin's approach wasn't perfect. The slowness frustrated people like Jacob who wanted immediate action. The caution meant some opportunities were missed. The invisibility meant the network couldn't directly confront injustice in ways that might have helped. But the approach worked. It preserved community, maintained humanity, prepared people for freedom, proved that strategic resistance could succeed where dramatic rebellion typically failed. What happened on the Carter plantation wasn't unique. Throughout the South, enslaved people organized resistance in countless ways, most of which remain undocumented, because they were deliberately hidden. They created invisible nations within plantations, practiced freedom internally while externally enslaved, maintained human dignity despite systematic dehumanization, prepared for liberation across generations. Benjamin's network was exceptional in its sophistication and documentation, but it represented broader patterns of resistance that existed everywhere slavery existed. As we reflect on this story, consider what it teaches about freedom. Freedom isn't just legal status, it's consciousness, it's community, it's the maintenance of human dignity despite oppression. People can be legally enslaved while maintaining internal freedom through resistance to psychological domination. People can practice freedom through how they relate to each other, how they educate their children, how they preserve culture, how they organize collectively, even when external circumstances deny formal freedom. Benjamin's network practiced freedom for 8 years while legally enslaved. They made collective decisions, created governance structures, distributed resources, resolved disputes, educated children, preserved culture, supported families, all the things free communities do. They were free in the ways that mattered most, even though law defined them as property. That internal freedom, maintained despite external bondage, prepared them to navigate formal freedom effectively when it arrived. The story also reminds us that meaningful change is often generational. Benjamin didn't see the full fruition of his work in his lifetime. The network he built influenced movements in communities decades after he died. The teaching stories he created carried wisdom forward through generations. His impact extended far beyond what he could observe, because he understood he was planting seeds that would grow in other seasons. This long-term perspective, this willingness to work for futures he wouldn't see, characterized Benjamin's approach. He didn't need immediate victory to justify his efforts. He understood that resistance had value even when it didn't produce instant results, that preparation mattered even when you couldn't be certain freedom would come, that maintaining humanity had intrinsic worth beyond instrumental goals. Benjamin Clarke organized a rebellion that transformed 200 lives and influenced countless others. He did it without violence, without dramatic confrontation, without drawing attention from those who held power over him. He did it through intelligence, through organization, through strategic thinking, through determination to preserve Black humanity despite white supremacy's efforts to destroy it. His rebellion succeeded because it was invisible until it was too strong to crush.
Because it worked with patience and persistence rather than dramatic gestures. Because it understood that the most revolutionary act was maintaining full humanity and dignity despite dehumanization. Because it prepared people for freedom they didn't yet possess. Remember Benjamin Clarke. Remember the network he built, the invisible rebellion he organized, the community he strengthened, the humanity he preserved. Remember that resistance takes many forms, that the most effective rebellion isn't always the most visible, that strategic thinking can accomplish what force cannot. Remember that enslaved people were never passive victims, but active resistors who used every tool available to fight for freedom, dignity, and humanity. His legacy lives in every community that organizes invisibly, in every movement that works patiently for long-term change, in every person who maintains dignity despite oppression, in every teacher who passes knowledge despite prohibitions, in every leader who builds institutions that will outlast them. The methods may change, the circumstances may differ, but the core truth persists. Human dignity cannot be destroyed. Communities can organize despite oppression. Resistance continues even when invisible, and freedom begins in the mind and spirit before it arrives in law.
If Benjamin Clarke's story inspired you, if his intelligent and strategic resistance moved you, if you understand now how enslaved people organized invisible rebellions that transformed their communities, then subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. We bring you powerful stories of resistance, courage, and brilliant minds that changed history every week. These are the forgotten heroes, whose strategies still teach us, whose courage still inspires us, whose humanity still challenges us to be better. Share this video with someone who needs to know that resistance takes many forms, that strategic thinking can defeat oppression, that maintaining dignity despite dehumanization is itself revolutionary. Leave a comment telling us what Benjamin's story means to you, how it changes your understanding of resistance and freedom, what lessons you'll carry forward. These stories matter. These lives matter. This history matters. Remember that the most effective rebellion is often the one no one notices until it's too late to stop, and that every person who maintains humanity despite oppression continues Benjamin Clarke's legacy. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time with another story that deserves to be remembered and celebrated.